over the last 20 years, I have been absolutely immersed in reporting on a whole succession of global and British crises. All right, breaking stories, making forecasts about what was going to happen. Global financial crisis, followed by the British decision to leave the EU, followed by that incredible mess over the terms of leaving the EU, followed by COVID. As a sort of reporter on these things, as a forecaster of what's going to happen, this has been, the last few weeks since Trump became president, has been the most stressful and unnerving of my entire career. And the reason for that is not because those previous crises weren't really severe and really bad, either for the world or for Britain, but it's because during the global financial crisis, when we voted for Brexit, when we had COVID, it was possible to amass data and to make some predictions that were pretty well grounded about what was actually going to happen to us, how bad the recession would be, what the financial costs would be. I could basically talk to you and to others on air with confidence about what's going to happen. Because so much of the uncertainty is about one individual, Donald Trump, who changes his mind between, breakfast, 11's, lunch and supper time multiple times. He announces a whole range of different shocking things in the course of a day. He starts off by making one set of scary announcements about tariffs, then he modifies as you go on. It's the impossibility of making a rational forecast that is a nightmare for somebody like me, and it's a nightmare for businesses too. One of the reasons the economy is slowing down is because big international businesses located all over the world are sort of in a state of panic because they just cannot rationally assess the economic climate even a few weeks out in order to make investments. So this is a really terrible period.
Nobody likes being bullied, right? And a lot of people feel that's what Trump's doing to his allies, or supposedly his allies. And a lot of people feel we're kind of being pushed around and bullied. And we Brits seem to be absolutely of the view, and I think for understandable reasons. And so far, Keir Starmer's poll ratings have been pretty good, partly as the result, I think, of British people thinking, well, he's trying to be the grown-up in the room. But I'm just not sure people listening to this podcast, some of them may, but I think a lot of people don't really like the kind of sense of, we just got to do whatever we just got to plead with the Americans not to beat us too much. It's just not a very attractive kind of attitude. And you've talked about the digital services tax, which will be under a lot of pressure to drop. I don't think kowtowing to the tech bros is going to be particularly popular. But I think people listening to us discussing this are going to have one question for you. I certainly have a question for you. To what extent can we get back on our feet and stand up to the Americans a bit more?
I think it is just worth pointing out to listeners something that I do not think is widely known, which is on April the 2nd, in just a few days' time, Washington, the Trump administration, has said that it will come up with a number, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12%, which it believes for the UK and indeed for all sorts of other nations is effectively what they see as the tariff and sort of proxy tariff that they say we are imposing on the US, right?
So VAT.
So through a whole variety of things.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I am genuinely horrified that the British government is even having this conversation with Washington. So Donald Trump has decided that sales taxes like VAT somehow discriminate against American businesses, which is literally the biggest load of economic nonsense you could possibly think of, because the whole point about VAT is it applies to anybody who sells within the UK, whether they're a British company, whether they're an American company, whether they're a French company, it does not discriminate on the basis of country of origin. It just applies to just the goods and services for which VAT, is applicable,
yeah.
right? Because VAT is higher than the sales taxes of individual US states, they are basically looking at that and saying, oh, well, that means that we're discriminating unfairly against American businesses. Absolute nonsense, right? But we're having a conversation with them on the basis that they take that view. To be clear, we're not going to cut VAT at the behest of the Americans, but we are conscious that they are calculating what they want from us in other terms if we're not going to cut VAT. So another tax that they hate, which again is not discriminatory on the basis of nationality. It is the digital sales tax. It's a 2% levy on the UK sales of digital giants. Those are digital businesses that have turnover in the UK of more than £500 million. And to be clear, it's a perfectly reasonable tax. It was introduced by the last government in 2020, and it's intended to level the playing fields of British retailers and British media companies, all of whom have way higher overheads because they have to operate out of shops and offices, way higher overheads than the likes of Amazon and Google and Facebook, Meta. And so basically it gets £800 million a year from these businesses. There's a slight levelling the playing field between these companies and UK companies. Now, to be clear, the only reason they pay that tax, your Amazons and your Metas, is not because they're American. It is just because they dominate that kind of digital industry. The British government is taking seriously a request from the Americans to either cut or remove that tax. I think it's outrageous we're taking it seriously. I mean, if you think about the passion...
Go on, Robert, say what you really think, mate.
But if you think about... look, you and I lived through the stress, right? You and I lived through the stress of the referendum leading up to Brexit. Right.
Well, we should explain why. Let's jump in there. So I'm going to let you carry on. But part of the reason I think we found it so stressful was the gap sometimes between what people believed to be true and what actually was true. And I think, in a way, for me, it was that was the first signs that we were beginning the disinformation age, where people were like, we're going to believe what we want to believe. We don't, we've got our own facts. And I think that was just so counter to what you and I had grown up with, which is that people in our position, of course, inexpertly, haphazardly, not always correctly, and sometimes, of course, with biases here and there. I'm not saying we were, but everyone, no one is perfect. Everyone comes at it from the perspective of their own education and all the rest of it. But we were all trying. We're all impartial broadcasters. We're all governed by Ofcom. We were really trying to kind of establish these facts, and that was the beginning of the period for me where it just got harder to get the public to get some publicly accepted facts and analysis. Anyway, that's my take on it. Carry on.
And that was certainly a big source of the stress that one felt. One of the more credible so-called sovereignty arguments that those who wanted to leave the EU made was that it was important for the British Parliament to decide taxes in the UK, right? Because obviously, when we were members of the EU, there were limitations on what we could do with our own taxation imposed by Brussels. So, for example, you weren't allowed to cut VAT once you were a member of the EU and in the EU single market. Now, that was regarded by those who wanted to leave the EU as outrageous. To be clear, when we were members of the EU, we may not have been able to boss the rest of the EU around, but we had a vote, we had a voice, right? When decisions were made on things relating to tax or trading rules and all the rest of it, we had a voice, and a pretty influential voice. People took Britain seriously within the EU, right? What this government is currently contemplating is allowing a bully American president to simply say he doesn't like a British tax, and we are thinking about doing what he says. I mean, that just seems to me
he wouldn't. Yeah, I mean,
utterly outrageous.
I suppose if he was here, I'm not a bully. America's just the most powerful economy in the world. I'm trying to get a good deal, but I think that leads me to my.
But even though you're not going to accept the bully thing,
No, but
I don't think it's a very amount of evidence that what I've just said about him is, pretty well founded. But even if you're not, it is nonetheless the case that he is basically saying, I don't care what the British Parliament wants. If I think you've got a tax that's bad for America, I'm going to force you to. And that is shocking that we're even having that conversation.
Okay, but let's accept your term. A lot of people in Britain do think he's kind of pushing the world around or bullying or whatever term you want to use. Almost everyone would agree the way to deal with a bully is to stand up to.
Exactly.
And
we're not. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah, and I guess that's my question. Like we've had a whole lot of new revelations, as we're recording this, maybe more if you're listening to it in a few days' time, about the nature of that signals chat in America, the kind of, classified, well, they said it wasn't classified. Now it turns out they very clearly were discussing classified information on it. That has, of course, implications for intelligence sharing and all the rest of it. But also, we've had the confirmation today that J.D. Vance is going to Greenland, and now the Danish government saying all events have been cancelled. So the only thing they're apparently going to do is go to a US base there. And I guess what I find myself thinking is, okay, what is the direction of travel here? Do I think it is completely impossible we might wake up one morning to discover that American transport planes have been flying soldiers into, a part of Greenland overnight, and it's effectively now occupied by Americans? Of course, I'd like to think that's impossible. That would be the destruction of the world order as we know it. Do I think it's impossible? No, given how they're conducting themselves, given the things they're saying, I don't know that is impossible. So I guess my question to you on this is really about, whether it's about economics or anything else, is there more we can do?
Yeah,
can we? And what would that look like if? And
so let's get back. So you made the really sensible point that the only way to deal with a bully is to stand up to the bully, right? No question. Okay. All personal experience and history suggests that is what you have to do. You have to. Now, here is a very simple fact, right? Yes, America is the world's biggest single national economy, right? But, okay, if you add together the value of the EU's economy, other European countries' economies, including the UK's, Canada, Australia, Japan, just those, right? The value of those economies, the purchasing power of those economies is way bigger than that of the American economy. And American multinational companies are massively dependent on selling to the EU, to the UK, to Canada, to Australia, to Japan, right? If the leaders of those countries were capable of getting together and issuing a very simple statement and said, if Trump imposes a tariff of X, we will impose a tariff on American exporters of 2X, at that point, both the market reaction, which would be incredibly negative, and indeed the reaction of the individual bosses of American companies, they would panic, they would be, at that point, I do think the bully Trump would have to back down, because actually the rest of the world would say, we're gonna coordinate, we can look after each other, and we are going to absolutely tank your economy. Okay. He would have to stand down at that point.
Okay, that is a very, well, let's see if it happens. Doesn't feel very likely this minute, but who knows?
Somebody like Mark Carney, who is somebody who has been at the top not only of the Bank of England, but of an international institution called the Financial Stability Board, who is incredibly well connected, he is standing up to Trump.
Yeah.
Right now, Trump is basically seemingly getting his way because basically the leaders of the rest of the democratic world are not coordinating. I do think whether it's now or in a few weeks' time, when quite a lot of damage will have been done, they will have to coordinate because of the potential damage.